Hey, Emu, thank you very much for hanging out with me. I wanted to get a chance to learn with you today, and I appreciate you. Um, uh, I appreciate you. Uh,
I appreciate you too. It's
well, I
really nice.
appreciate you. Emu, you're appreciated. Thanks for being here.
That's so great. Shir HaMaalot. Shir HaMaalot is Psalm 126, and it's fairly well known as it is sung in many homes, including my home, right before bensching on festive occasions like Shabbos and holidays. But as is often the case when studying Torah, texts that are well known to us may not be as well understood as we might have previously thought. Take a close look at Shir HaMaalot, and you'll notice it's full of repetition and some really strange imagery. How do we make sense of so much going on in just 6 short verses? That's what we'll be exploring over the course of this season by breaking down this parak of Tehilim, analyzing it, and seeing if it may have any textual parallels to other places in Tanakh. But before we dive in, I want to acknowledge something important. The psalm opens up with the words, Beshuv Hashem et Shivat Zion, when God returns the captives of Zion. Those words, along with the rest of the psalm, they struck me, and they may have hit a chord for you as well. This parak clearly deals with the captives of Zion and the hope and the joy of their return. We are living in a time where there are currently numerous captives of Zion, hostages, whose return we are still fighting and praying for. Now, that's something we're not going to address overtly in this season, but you can be sure that it was very much in our minds and in our hearts as we were recording. As such, we dedicate this season to those hostages, the ones who were murdered in captivity, the ones we are still fighting and praying for, and the ones who God has so graciously and miraculously returned home. May God bring all of our captives home, and may we see the joy of the complete return of all of Israel to Zion. With that in mind, let's return to the text of the Psalm, Shir HaMaalot, and see what worlds of insight lie waiting for us just beneath the surface. From Aleph Beta, this is A Book Like No Other, generously sponsored by Shari and Nathan Lindenbaum.
So I thought maybe the first thing we would do is do something that a teacher of mine, Rabbi Yosef Leibowitz, who was the rabbi of my shul out in Berkeley, California, when I was growing up there as a teenager, taught me to do whenever looking at a psalm. And he said the first thing you do is you try to break it into parts. My feeling here is that the psalm has two natural parts. It breaks into two parts. What I'd like to do is actually just read through it in English and Hebrew with you, just kind of get ourselves familiar with what the psalm is. But as you listen to the words, ask yourself where you would break the psalm into. Let's read it through.
Okay, Shir HaMaalot, a song of steps or ascents. Beshuv Adonai et Shivat Zion, Hayinu Kecholmim. When God brought back the returnings of Zion, we
Turnees of
were
Zion. Yep.
returnees, Shivat Zion. We were as dreamers. This felt like a dream when God brought back the captives.
Mhm.
Az Yimales Chok Pinu. Then our mouths were filled with laughter, Ulashonenu Rina, and our tongues with song.
Mhm.
As then, Yomru Vagoyim will be said amongst the nations, Higdil Adonai Asoti Mele. God did great things with
With
these
these
people.
people. Mm.
Higdil Adonai Lasot Imanu. And so it seems like the psalm is saying, indeed, God has done great things with us. Hayinu Simechim. We were really happy. We were really joyful.
Mhm.
Um, Shuva Adonai et Shivitenu. God should return our captives. Ka'afikim banegev, like streams in the dry land.
Like flash
What-
floods in the Negev desert.
Mhm.
These really huge, outpourings of water that seem to come out of nowhere.
Right. Sounds like it's saying that it should be so fast and so unexpected. It would be like the afikim, kafikim banegev.
Mhm.
Hazorim bidima, berina yiktzoru. Those who plant in tears, in joy shall they reap. Haloch yelech uvacho. He who goes in crying and in sadness, nosei mesha chazara, carrying the measure of seed. Bo yavo verina. He should come back this time with joy, nosei alumotav, the carrier of sheaves. So
Mhm.
in the beginning, he's right in the beginning of the process, you're sad and it's seeds, and by the end, you're joyful and you have the fruits of those seeds.
So, Emu, would you break it into, and what do you think the two parts are if you had to name them? What would be the best title for each part?
Yeah. Yeah. So my first thought would probably be to break it evenly, 3 verses and 3 verses. The first 3 and the second 3 begin with, the idea of Shivat Zion,
Mhm.
of, returning to Zion. In the beginning, it seems like there's this dream, like, here's what's gonna happen when God returns the
Mhm.
captives, and then, verse 4 seems like a prayer. It's like a, and how I would really hope for this to happen,
Yep.
for God to please return the captives. That would,
Mhm.
I guess, be my first instinct on a split.
And I would agree with you, right? It's almost like the psalmist gives it away for you by creating this headline at the beginning of each, which is almost exactly the same words. Shuv Hashem Shivat, Shuva Hashem et Shvitenu, right? Same thing. It's just a little bit of a difference. And the first time around, it's Beshuv Hashem et Shivat Zion. When God returns the captive of Zion, this is how it's going to be. It's going to be like we were as dreamers. And so there's this description in the first 3 verses of the way things are going to be when this thing happens.
Mhm.
And it's almost like a prophecy. But then the second 3 verses go back and reprise those words, but say it a little bit differently. Instead of this is how it's going to be, Shuva Hashem et Shvitenu, God, could you please actually make this happen?
And
That's a
do it
prayer.
quickly.
Could you please do it, do this thing quickly? So the first 3 verses is a description, and the second 3 verses is a prayer for that description to actually happen.
So I think verse 4 is a prayer. Verse 5 and 6 don't feel like prayers to me. Like I would say like verses 1, 2, 3 is a vision for the future, and verses 4, 5, 6 is like now that we're not in that future. Verse 4 is a prayer. Verse 5 and 6 are comfort to those who are, expecting that future. Like those who are sad, end up in a place where there's joy and fulfillment. You could still think you get two parts. It's just the parts would be about um the future, and then 4, 5, 6 is the present.
I see. So the present is, could you please make this happen in the future? Hey, in the present, things aren't that great,
Right.
but we are planting in tears. Don't worry about it. Things are
Yeah.
eventually going to be good. Uh huh. I like that.
Okay, so we had our two parts, our two halves of the psalm. One half that's kind of a prophecy of the future, and one half that's an expression of longing for that future. With that in mind, Rabbi Foreman wanted to zoom in specifically on the first half of the parak and examine some of the oddities in the text there. He suspected that that would set us up on a path to really understand what's happening under the surface of the first part of Shir HaMaalos.
There's 2 parts to the psalm, and the 2 parts kind of play off each other. But Emu, notice that sort of playing off of each other happens a lot in the psalm, right? There's a couple other parts that sound similar. What other parts in the first part of the psalm where you're not even sure what you're up to because is it this version of that? Is it that version of it? Where else do you get that?
There's in verse 2, there's Higdil Hashem la'asot im Ele, right? God has done greatly with these, and then we just repeat the exact same phrase right after another. Higdil Hashem la'asot imanu,
Yep,
right?
right. And why are we talking about Az Yom Rubagoyim? Then the Gentiles will say, Higdil Hashem Lasat Amela. That is how look how great it is that God did this with them. And then we go and say, Higdil Hashem Lasat Imanu. God did this great thing with us. Like if you're gonna say God did this great thing with us, like if the Israelites are the first person narrator here, so let it just be the first person. Why are we concerned with the Gentiles saying the same thing? And that's confusing, frankly. I mean, we sing this, and if you're not paying really close attention, you can get muddled. Which one you're up to? Say the wrong one. Think maybe you should go back to the beginning, start all over again.
Right.
Right? It happens here. It happens also with the Hayinu Kecholmim piece, right?
Hmm.
When God will return our captives, Hayinu Kecholmim, we will be as dreamers. But that's not the only time you have a Hayinu. Where else you got another Hayinu?
So there's Hayinu Kechalmim and Hayinu Semechim, right?
Right. Same thing. You're up to Hayinu Smechim. You're thinking, is it Hayinu Kacholmim? Is it Hayinu Smechim? I'm not sure. Maybe we should go back to the beginning. It's how do we understand all this repetition, all these playing off of each other? And it strikes me that there's a method to that madness. And I wanted to kind of share with you a theory about that. So what I want to suggest actually is that the first part of the psalm actually has a story. And one of the virtues of creating a story out of something is you take a whole bunch of things and you make it one thing, right? People can remember stories because it's a story. So here too, I want to suggest that if you think about the first part of the psalm, it looks like there's a whole bunch of things going on. It looks actually like there's 5 things going on. But I want to suggest that those 5 things aren't really 5 things. They're one thing because they're all connected and there's a story. Let's
Mm.
first look at what those 5 things are without the story and just see how random they are. Thing number 1, B'shuv Hashem et Shivat Zion, Hayinu Kecholmim. When God returns the captives of Zion, we were like dreamers. That's thing number 1. Thing number 2, Az Yumales Chakpinu L'Shonenu Rina. We were really happy. We were laughing. Our mouths were filled with song. Thing number 3, Az Yomer Bagoyim Higdil Hashem Lasot Imela. Then the nations will say, "Here, how great is God that He's done this with them." That's thing number 3. Things number 4 is we will say, "Higdil Hashem la'asot imanu." How great is God that He's done this with us? And thing number 5 is Hayinu smechim. We were happy. And so the great question is, how do those things tie together? And the answer is there's a story. They're an unfolding story.
Mm.
One kind of leads to the other. And like with any story, any good story has 2 elements to it. This I go back to the great Aaron Sorkin line, which is that every story has got to have an intention and an obstacle, right? Any story that you have has got to have 2 things. It's got to have something that a protagonist wants really badly, and it's got to have some sort of obstacle that's standing in the way. Then you've got a story. If you don't have that, no matter how interesting things seem to be, you don't really have a story. So here the question is, if this is a story about Shivat Zion, about the way God will redeem our captives, what is the intention and what's the obstacle?
I mean, my first instinct without reading the verses carefully would be the intention is we want our captives home. We want to return to Zion.
So you would think, right? Like you would tell me, like if we're going to talk about returning our captives, then the most important thing I want is my captives home. Except that's not the case because we're talking about a case where that has happened already, right? The setting for the story is the return of the captives of Zion. So we're not telling a story about whether they will return or not. We're telling a story of what happens when they return. So that's not the intention anymore. The intention is we want something when they return.
Right. If I'm going to be a careful text reader, I will jump to the end to look for the intention.
Okay.
And at the end of verse 3, they have joy. Hayinu semechim, we were happy.
Exactly.
So is it possible that we're dealing with a people who are depressed or people who are deeply saddened and they can't feel joy?
Well, the same way, Emu, that you looked to the text to tell you what the intention is, look to the text to tell me what the obstacle is. If the intention is we want to be happy about it, what would
Yeah.
stand in the way of being happy? I mean, like, this is the happiest thing in the world. What's standing in
Right.
the way?
So we could cut the verses short, right? If I were the editor, I could be like, "Sure, God returned the captives. We're happy."
Right.
But that's actually not what you get. What you get is hayinu kecholmim. It didn't feel
Mm,
real. When God
that's right.
returns the captives, feels like a dream because we're so, I would imagine, so steeped in sadness and the expectation that our
Yes.
reality is grim
Yes.
that when something good happens, I don't even believe it. My
Yes.
reality,
Yes.
goodness feels like a dream and badness feels like life.
Exactly. So therefore, you just met the obstacle. What is the obstacle to feeling happy?
And not trusting that good happens in the world.
Yeah, well, now you're getting philosophical. In the
Okay.
words of the text, what does the text tell you the obstacle is?
That they're in a daze.
That they're in a daze. The obstacle is I'm in a daze. I want to be happy, but I'm in a daze. How do I get happy if I'm in a daze? That is
Mhm.
the story of the first
Mhm.
part of the psalm.
Hmm.
Intention, obstacle. It's like the best thing in the world. I'm dying to be happy. I don't know how to be happy because it doesn't even feel real. I'm so dazed.
Hmm.
How do I get out of the daze? How do I make this even feel real?
Hmm.
And now you can get more philosophical. Why are you in a daze? Because reality has been so depressing. Didn't even see how things could change. It's so out of my experience that when it happens in a flash, I'm utterly unprepared. Right? It's like, what do I even do? I can't assimilate this reality. And what's the danger, by the way, if I can never get to Hayinu Smechim, if I remain in Hayinu Kecholmim land?
Then I'll be depressed no matter what happens. Like I'll just be
Yeah,
trapped in
it's like the
sadness.
worst. Imagine the best thing has happened to you, and it just skips off of your consciousness because you just can't even accept it, right? How do I assimilate this new reality? So in an emotional way, if I'm stuck in Hayinu Kachomim land, I was like dreamers. The challenge is there a
Yeah.
journey from Hayinu Kachomim to Hayinu Smechim? And now you see, Imu, why Hayinu Kachomim, Hayinu Smechim sound so similar. It's supposed to trip you up. It's supposed to be that when you sing this, you're not sure which one you're in. The whole point is, how do I get from this thing to from this phase to another phase? How do I turn that little switch to journey from Hayinu Kachomim to Hayinu Smechim? We were
Mm,
like dreamers till we were actually happy. I can't be
mm.
happy. I can't have any emotion if I'm in a dream.
It's funny. It reminds me actually of that first week of leaving Egypt is like until they get to the splitting of the sea. They don't, you don't hear them singing or that joyful in that
Mhm.
first week. At- and then when they get to the sea, only after the sea, right? Does they, Shonenu Rina, do they actually like sing a song? But even after that, right? In the story of Mara, right, they're bitter. Like there is this idea of just because something good happens to you doesn't mean that you automatically switch your mood and your attitude. Like actually, um, it, it can feel like a dream. It can feel like maybe it didn't really happen. I think one of the things that we often struggle with when trying to understand Dor Hamidbar, the people of the desert, is like, hey, you were saved. Let's move on. And they don't appear to be able to move on, right? They're very wary of their new reality, whether they can trust it. And even their right after Az Yashir, right after they sing their song, they get Tamara and they experience this bitterness, right? Like you have the juxtaposition of song and bitterness, the juxtaposition of like uh, initial joy, but also can I really trust this? I think that's what it's reminding me of.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I hadn't really thought about it in terms of that, but in a way, you're right. The very first return to Zion, we might say, was, at least on the national level, was the exodus from Egypt when everyone was going to Zion, when everyone was going to the land of Israel. And what you're arguing is maybe that was a version of Ayinu Kechomim, that the malady that struck people there was that they just couldn't assimilate the reality of what was happening to them because amazing things were happening to them. But how do you take that in?
So, by bringing up the Exodus story, I'd taken us on a little bit of a tangent, but one that both of us thought was relevant and resonant. You see, the first half of Shir HaMaalot seemed to be dealing with a problem. The captives were redeemed, but were too much in a daze to experience the joy of that redemption. And when thinking about the Israelites coming out of Egypt, they seemed to be dealing with this same problem. They too had been redeemed, but seemed to be stuck in a daze that kept them from coming to a place of joy. It was powerful to see the resonances in what seemed to be parallel situations, especially so many generations apart. But returning to Shir HaMalos, if the obstacle was that they were in a daze, and that was keeping them from the intention of reaching a state of joy, how do you actually get past that obstacle? That was the question that we were left with. And Rabbi Foreman was suggesting that the answer was this 5-part story in the first half of the psalm. So we turned back to that story to see how it would unfold.
So we've identified the intention and the obstacle in the story. So having identified the intention and obstacle, let's tell the story.
Mhm.
How do you get to the resolution of Hayinu Smechim from your starting position, Hayinu Gechomim? So let's read through the story. Let's read through the 5 stages. Stage 1, the problem. We were like dreamers. We were in a
Mm-hmm.
daze. It just didn't even feel real. Stage two is Az Yamales Chokpinu Uloshanenu Rina. If I'm in a dream, what part of your mind is active and what part of your mind is passive? The subconscious mind gets to play, right?
Yes.
What's the hallmark of a dream? Like when you start telling a dream over during the day, what's the
Absurdity.
hallmark? Absurdity. Dreams are always absurd. Always something really weird that just doesn't make sense happens, and
Hmm.
you're always like embarrassed about it because,
Yeah, and like, oh, we
yeah,
were at your house, but also it was Costa Rica.
right.
And right.
Exactly. It
Mm-hmm.
never makes any sense, which is weird. Why? The answer is because your mind has two basic aspects to it, right? Your subconscious mind, your conscious mind. So the hallmark of your conscious mind is everything makes sense. And during the day, your conscious mind gets to be in charge and everything makes sense and everything is ordered. And that's the way you live your life. But your subconscious mind doesn't care about things making sense. The subconscious mind is not really concerned with all those things. So the absurdity is the mark of the subconscious mind. So here you have this notion that if I'm dreaming, the one thing that I can't do is cognize what's going on. The real problem I have in being happy, happiness would flow through if I could actually wrap my mind around what was happening, if I
Mm-hmm.
could get it, right? If I could get it logically, understand that this is what's happening, then I could have an emotion which flows from that. The problem is my mind can't wrap itself around it. At least my conscious mind can't. And therefore, the one thing I can't do is speak about it. Words are the tools of the conscious mind. It's how we take things and make sense of them. I make
Mm-hmm.
sense of the world through my ability to talk about it, to create subjects and verbs and objects and syntax and all of those things. And that's the one thing that I absolutely can't do if I'm entirely overwhelmed. That's why I feel like I'm in a dream. I'm literally speechless. There's
Mm-hmm.
still things you can do with your mouth if your conscious, logical part of your mind is not yet working. What else can you do with your mouth that can express things if you can't talk words?
Yeah. You can laugh and you can sing.
And you can cry. You can laugh, sing, and cry. And this psalm is about all three of those things. And
Mm.
here in this verse, we get laughter and singing. I may not be able to understand yet logically, but that subconscious part of my mind will still let me laugh. It will still let me sing. There's something about that which just goes beyond the this world very logical kind of thing that I use words for. I can laugh, I can sing, and that's the first way that I'll express this overwhelming feeling, which is which is sweeping over me and that I feel swept away with. So
It's
that's stage
there's
two.
it's lovely. First of all, the idea that there are three things that you can do with your mouth that are different than speaking, that are an expression of sort of like how you feel. That isn't just description of how you feel. But I also see something in these verses that supports your idea that they're in a dreamlike state beyond the word that they were as dreamers. It doesn't really say that they were laughing and singing. It says "azimale sechokpinu," which is that laughter would be filled in our mouths and song would fill our tongues, and that's not active. That's not like, and we chose to laugh, but it's almost like the unconscious filled our mouths with laughter. The unconscious,
Yeah,
um,
that's really cool. It's almost as if if you think about a dream, the paralysis that hits the body in a dream, like your sense of laughing in a dream would be like that. If I'm laughing in the dream, the feeling would be that I can't actually laugh the way I would usually laugh, which is an active thing. My mouth is paralyzed, but somehow there's this laughter that's filling my mouth.
yeah,
That's what it would feel like if I am dream laughing, if I am dream singing. So you're right. Maybe it's a description of still being in a dream, but in the dream, I'm dream singing. In the dream, I'm dream laughing. But how do I break out of the dream? But the
yeah.
first stage is at least in the dream, I'm laughing. At least in the dream, I'm singing.
I'm also struck now by something you taught in a course I think that predates Aleph Beta, around laughter, and like the very nature of laughter, which
Mhm.
is that all good jokes or all laughter sort of emerges from uh, either absurdity or really like the confluence of opposites. So, like, if there's a guy who slips on a banana peel, right? He's standing up straight, he's vertical, and then he goes horizontal. There's something funny about that. And it's even funnier if that guy is particularly proud, if he's wearing a top hat, if he's wearing a monocle, if he's an arrogant person. It's even funnier that that
Mm.
guy is the one who slips because there's this juxtaposition of opposites. And so,
It's interesting. What you're suggesting, I think, is that the nature of laughter is that it is a response to absurdity. So
yeah,
if a dream is by nature absurd, so the first step in coming to grips with it, if it's good, is like, okay, I guess I could laugh about it. Like laughter is something which we do with the absurd. It's so absurd. Like I can still be in the dream and all of the absurdity of the dream, and I can dream laugh about it, and then maybe stage two is having dream laughed about it. Maybe I can even dream sing about it. Maybe singing is a step away from the absurdity of laughter into
yeah,
another kind of
I
expression.
yeah, I
Yeah.
think so too. And it reminds me of someone who laughed at good news, right? It reminds me actually of Sarah, right? Like here's a person who spent her life in sadness and great frustration that she couldn't bear a child, and when she overheard that she was going to, bear a child, she laughed, and it sort of makes sense because, like, was she ready to just process the fact that, like, oh, everything's gonna be great and you're gonna be a mom now all of a sudden. Like,
Mhm.
she's processing her emotions, and so she laughs.
That's very beautiful.
Yeah.
By the way, you mentioned Sarah. True, even for Sarah. If you go back to that verse, right, where Sarah laughs, right, and she names the child Laughter because of that,
Mhm.
right. So that would be in Genesis 21, verse 3. Vayikra Avram Shem beno hanolad lo asher yalda lo Sarah Yitzchak. So Abraham calls that child Laughter after. The laughter that Sarah experienced when hearing about this. It sounded so absurd. And then if you look at Sarah's response, Batomer Sarah says, "Tzichokas ali Elokim." God has made a laughter for me. This is just absurd. And look at the very next verse. The very next verse is all of a sudden she breaks into poetry. Vatomer mi milel Avraham enika banim Sarah ki aladati ben lizkunav. It's actually a little ditty. She's actually reverting to song. She's making up a little song, right? Mi milel Avram. Who would have told Abraham that Sarah would ultimately nurse children
Mhm.
for him, that I have given a child to him in his old age, right? It's poetry all of a sudden, because the only way she can express herself is something that goes beyond the cognitive. Let me make a little song about this.
Mm.
So I think you're right about that sort of transition from laughter into song is the ways that we begin to make things real.
Mm.
So let's go back to our story, right? Our unfolding story, and see if we can tell the rest of it. So so far we've got, we start, we're like dreamers, and then in the dream, I love that notion that we're not even laughing, but our mouths were passively filled with laughter, as if we're still paralyzed, still within the dream world, but we're still dream laughing, we're dream singing, we're trying to break out of the dream. And then something happens that shatters the dream. Something gets through cognitively. Suddenly there's words. Higdil Hashem lasot imela. Somebody's talking. Az yomru bagoyim. It's not us. How come all of a sudden we can cognize it?
Well, it's not us. They're cognizing it.
Exactly. They're cognizing it. It's not happening to them. The nations around us looking on, they can get it.
They can see it before we can.
They can see it before we can. They can understand it before we can. So they get it. They're like, "Oh my gosh, this is pretty significant. We can analyze this. You know what this is about? Higdil Hashem Lasati Mela. Look at how amazing God is that He's done this with these guys, right? That is cognitive, but we're not the people who say it. They can say it because they're not experiencing it. But the reason why we care is because we hear it. And when we hear it, look what we say. Almost exactly the same thing. Why do we say almost exactly the same thing?
We didn't get it
We
beforehand.
we didn't get it beforehand. We heard what they were saying, and having heard what they were saying, they gave us the words. We took their words. It's like, "Oh, really? That's what's happening? I guess that's what's happening. Higdil Hashem lasot imela." You're right. Higdil Hashem lasot imanu. It is amazing what God has done to us. And suddenly we've got it
Wow.
in our brains. We've
Wow.
got it in our minds. And now that we've got it, and we've wrapped our cognitive mind about it, our conscious mind, hayinu smechim, we're no longer hayinu kacholmim in a dream. Now we're actually happy in the real
Hmm.
world.
Hmm. This is really beautiful. Like, look at this little story that you slowed down and actually uh, shared here. This is incredible. It reminds me of this show that I'm watching. I think it's called Couples Therapy. What's fascinating to me is this therapist is often going to childhood trauma. She wants to know like what happened to you in your life, and they tell these terrible stories about parents who were abusive or who did terrible things, and often the person relaying these stories doesn't really know that what happened to them as a kid was terrible. And the therapist needs to say that. The therapist needs to say, wow, that sounds really terrible.
Mhm.
And the what I notice is that the people are often saying, like, oh, it was terrible. Like they didn't know almost. They didn't like really get it until they hear someone on the outside saying what it means to them. And so that's what I'm hearing here, but counterintuitively, the opposite, actually about something good. Like,
Yeah.
here is people who've been through trauma who are now being redeemed, and they can't be happy immediately.
Yeah.
Um, it's sort of shocking.
It is.
So we'd explored the 5 stages laid out in the story of the first half of Shir HaMaalos, of getting from the dreamlike days to laughter and song, then to cognition of the outsider, moving to personal cognition, and finally to a state of joy. And by tracking this story in the first part of the Perek, we saw that this joyous prophecy of redemption is addressing something pretty deep. It's acknowledging the struggle of residual trauma even after a crisis has passed. And that happiness isn't a given or an immediate reaction, but a process. And it also highlighted the importance of the role of reaching a stage of cognition to finally achieving a state of real joy. Now, if you remember earlier on, I'd suggested that Israel during the Exodus was actually going through a similar process as the one being laid out in the first half of Shir HaMaalos. They too had been traumatized during their stay in Egypt, and it had seemed to me that they were struggling with processing that residual trauma in the desert, even after God had redeemed them. This idea had stuck with Rabbi Foreman, and it raised a question for him. If Israel indeed was in a daze when they left Egypt, if they really needed to process that residual trauma to get to a state of joy, did they ever achieve that? And if they did they go through the 5 stages laid out in Psalms to do it? Would we be able to see that process actually play out in the book of Exodus? So, on the spot, Rabbi Foreman invited me to jump over to Exodus and find out.
I want to go back to this thing that you kind of extemporaneously put in here and explore it for a minute with you, um, which is this notion that maybe our first national experience of this was the exile from Egypt and the return to Zion, right? Because let's try to sort of read through the 5 stages and try to actually see if they work. Do they actually apply to the Exodus? Would you go through that little game with me? Let's
Yeah,
see if we
sure.
can do that. Okay, so what if when we left Egypt after that 10th plague and we were marching forth, you'd assume that that was the most joyous moment in the world, right? But it
Right.
wasn't yet. They were like in a dream state. They were shocked. They were numb, right? So what then would Az Yamale Schok Pinu Ulashonenu Rina refer to? Maybe we don't have an example of Schok Pinu. I'm not sure if we do, but we certainly do of Ulashonenu Rina.
Can I make a suggestion on Slok Pinu? This may be like wild.
Sure.
I wonder, like, something did fill their mouths on those days when they left Egypt. Why are you
Yeah.
smiling? Do you know what I'm talking
You're
about?
thinking you're thinking of matzah.
I am thinking of matzah because there was a joke that was played with the matzah, right?
That is hilarious, actually, now that you think about it. Back in the Haggadah, right? What do we say about matzah? Lechem
Lechem
oni, we
oni.
ate it as slaves. And here we are being redeemed, and you think we finally get a decent piece of sourdough, but all we got is this lousy matzah, but for a great reason. It's hilarious. Like the reason why we're eating flatbread now is not because we're working so hard we don't have time to let our dough rise. It's because God redeemed us so quickly.
Yeah, the symbol of oppression now becomes the symbol of escape or the symbol of freedom.
Isn't that funny? So, in a way, matzah might be God's joke. Hey guys, it's matzah again, but for an entirely different reason. It's hilarious.
Right.
It's
Right.
absurd. The matzah is absurd, right? And our mouths were full of it, which, by the way, happens before we sing, because where did they eat matzah according to the text? It's before the Song of the Sea, right?
The whole 7 days, right? There's a 7-day festival of eating matzah, which
Yeah.
culminates at the Song of the Sea.
Yes. They leave in the middle of the night and they're in a dreamlike state. They eat
Mm,
the matzah in the dreamlike state. And then what could be more dreamlike than the absurdity of a sea splitting with walls of water and walking through?
mhm,
It's crazy town. It's the ultimate dream. That doesn't happen in the real world,
mhm.
but it does happen in the real world. Is this a dream? So what do? Ulashanei Arena, they sing. They sing. So they got this poetry. Now, if that's the song, is there an Az Yomru Bagoyim Higdil Hashem Lasot Imela?
That's
Then
in
the
the song.
nations will. So let's actually look back to the song and see if we can find that. The song is in Exodus, what is it, 15
15.
ish?
Mhm,
Okay. Can you find that in the song? So what's interesting is the song breaks into two parts. The first part of the song talks about the actual victory at the sea. The second part of the song talks about the reaction of the victory of the sea. Interestingly, the reaction of the nations.
mhm.
But if you look carefully, you won't, at least to
Well,
my eye, you won't
you don't get
actually
their
find,
words.
well, you don't get their words. If anything, they're speechless. You know
Mm,
why? When the redemption of the captives of Zion happens, something amazing happens to Israel, but nothing's really happening to the nations. So the nations are objective third person observers and they can cognize what's happening. Not so at the Song of the Sea. Song of the Sea, something great happened to Israel, but something cataclysmic happened to the leading nation of the world, which changes everything for the nations of the world. Because if God is going to come down and is going to assert his power in the world, then everything is different. And how does that manifest itself for the nations? The nations do respond. But interestingly, they are dumbstruck. Look at the first thing we hear about the nations.
mm. So this is
What
14. Shamu amim yirgazun. The nations hear and they tremble. Chiel achaz yoshve plashet. Right, these trembling pangs
trembling
have
hits
achaz.
them.
It's taken hold of them. This isn't something they're choosing to do. It's again the unconscious now is choosing for them that they
Yes,
tremble.
they're in a dream. They're
Yeah.
panicking. They're trembling. And they're, by the way, if you've ever trembled in fear, don't you actually have that feeling like you're paralyzed and what's happening to you is not of your own volition, but
Yeah.
it something is trembling you, like
Yeah.
you are being made to tremble? That's what it
Hmm.
feels like. Keep on reading the next verse, verse 15.
Azniv halu alofei Edom. The chieftains of Edom become terribly scared.
Right? Nivhal is, by the way, an interesting word. Do you know where the word nivhal appears elsewhere? Where else do we have nivhal?
Yosef's brothers.
Yes, Yosef's brothers. When were they nivhal, so discombobulated that they couldn't?
Yeah, it's almost like their blood drains. I think it's when they discover Benjamin's cup. Is that when it is,
No,
or
it's later. It's when Joseph reveals
when
himself
Yosef
to
reveals
them.
himself? Okay, I know it's basically this revelation, which should be like it should be a laughter moment because it's so shocking, but
right?
really
But it's
not a time
so
to laugh.
shocking that they're speechless, right? How's it go? Lo yachol la'anot ki nivhalu mipanav. Literally the same language. They were trembling, their mouths were agape. They couldn't say anything. So the same thing is happening now to Alafei Adom. All of these other nations are looking at it. They just can't even talk.
You knew that where that was, then you follow that at the tip of your tongue. It's like, oh, that's just like when they
You'll see there's a
reacted to
reason
seeing
why I
Moses.
knew it.
But
The Az nivhalu alufei Adam, you were saying before, what does the Az remind you of?
Az Yashir.
Hmm. We sing. So that's what we do because we can't talk about it, but somebody else who can't talk about it, they're just speechless. And that's
Hmm.
these Gentiles because their whole world is turned topsy turvy. So notice that through the whole second part of this song, we're talking about what's happening to the Gentiles, but it's not what's happening in our story of the psalm.
Mm-hmm.
There is no Az Yomru B'Goyim Higdil Hashem La'asot Imela.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, everyone in the Gentile world is discombobulated. Now, fascinatingly, if you think about that, right, the, this never changes, right? You keep on reading, Tipal Aleim Emata B'Pachad Bigdol Zeracha Yid Mukaven, right? This terrible fear falls upon them.
Even there, by the way, there's the word gadol, like bigdol. It's supposed to be higdil
Fascinating.
Hashem la sotimana, but here it's
You're right. It does seem to be a play of Higdil Hashem. Instead of Higdil Hashem Lasati Mela, Gentiles calmly looking at the situation saying, wow, that was very profound of God and wonderful of God to do this thing. They are literally trembling. Tipol Aleim, Emata Babachad. Ema is a deeper kind of fear than Rachad. It's a paralysis fear. Bigdol Zaracha, in the greatness of your power, Yidmu Ka'aven, they are literally paralyzed like stone. Ad Ya'avoram Hashem, until we pass into the land. The passing through the water will create such fear among the nations of Canaan that we'll be able to pass through the Jordan and pass into the land. And so it works for us in a way, this fear of the nations, because it sets up our ability to conquer Israel. But one could argue maybe it doesn't completely work for us because you don't have the
oh,
full
interesting.
expression of Psalm
You need the
126.
goyim. Mm-hmm.
You need the Goyim to actually be able to cognize it, to not be dumbstruck, so that you cannot be dumbstruck. And that never
Wow,
happens.
really? Because the penultimate thing in Shir HaMaalot, before we become truly happy, is that the nations are able to say Higdil Hashem
Exactly.
la'asot imela. It's
And
almost
if
like we
they
need
can't
them to
say that,
recognize it
that's right. And if they
before we
can't say
can.
that, where does that leave us as we leave Shirat Hayam?
Always questioning it.
Always
Always
questioning
questioning.
it,
Wow.
always questioning. And what happens next?
That's when they get to Mara. Right after they sang, they
And
regress.
listen to our whole Mara podcast, right? The whole thesis of that is that God gave them fresh water, but they couldn't even deal with it because of their memories and their trauma. It just felt like the bitterness of Egypt all over again, and we don't feel we can even drink it. It's almost as if they took fresh water and saw it as bitter water, and somehow they impute bitterness almost everywhere. They just, God keeps on giving them things. God gives them manna. They can't even deal with that. They can't just do the three simple laws. All you have to do with manna is just do this. It's like, no, no, no. And God keeps on trying to just sort of tease them into this idea that, hey, it's going to be okay. Hey, it's going to be okay. Hey, it's going to be okay. And the people have a very hard time with that. And somehow they never quite get to Hayinus Smechem. And if you think about the cataclysms in the desert, I wonder if that's part of the reason why.
I have to say, I found our exploration into the Exodus story fascinating. It brought out for me that, regardless of whether the psalmist actually had the Exodus story in mind when he wrote Shir HaMaalot, it still resonated through the Exodus story because it was dealing with something that's true of human nature. He's dealing with how we process trauma. And the Exodus story seemed to beautifully reflect the Israelites' attempt to process their trauma and come to a place of joy, as well as the consequences of perhaps not having processed it fully, and not in the way set out by Shir HaMaalot. Ultimately, what Rabbi Foreman shared with me today isn't as much about intertextuality as it is about the nature of human psychology. And that makes this parak of Tehilim mean so much more to me, partially because it helps us get in touch with our own human psychology, and partially because it's seemingly telling us a spiritual reality. What a beautiful way to end this season. Except we're not done with the season, not by a long shot. We've only seen half of the psalm. What did Rabbi Foreman have up his sleeve for the second half of Shir HaMaalot? Well, I'm going to give you a little tease. You know how the psalm opens up with dreamers and it ends with sheaves of wheat? Dreamers, dreams, and sheaves of wheat. Dreams and sheaves of wheat. Does that remind you of anything? Well, I don't know about you, but it reminds me of Yosef, the dreamer, and his infamous dream of the sheaves of wheat. Could there really be a connection between this psalm and the Yosef story? And what does that have to do with moving from a dreamlike daze to a state of joy? Join us next time to find out.
All right, Emu, see you next time. We'll pick up again.
That was terrible. Let's do it again. This was the worst thing ever. Hi, it's Emu again, and if you're enjoying this podcast, I really want to encourage you to check out aleph-beta.org. We have an entire library of podcasts just like this one, as well as stunning animated Torah videos on every parsha and holiday. It's the perfect place, I think, to immerse yourself in Torah. There are no ads, there are no distractions, there are no cat videos, or worse, showing up in your feed. So check it out, aleph-beta.org, or click the link in the description.